As I have argued frequently, the India-China relationship is a very complex relationship. It's not an either-or relationship. It's not a relationship merely of adversaries or of collaborators. It is a mix of both. And it is extremely important that in carrying forward this relationship, that sort of balance should be maintained. Areas where we have convergence with the Chinese, we should pursue those areas of convergence. We should maintain the high level engagement that we have been able to maintain for the last 15 years, because my own personal experience has been, having sat in many of those meetings, that those summit meetings play a very important role in introducing a degree of, shall I say, calm on what could be otherwise troubled waters in the relationship. That does not mean that when our interests are threatened by what China is doing, that we should not respond to it. Certainly we should respond. In areas where there are differences in perspective, we should try and overcome those differences in perspective. But if there is clear evidence that China is working against India's interest, certainly India should respond. And I think by and large, if I look at the record of the last 15 years or so, generally speaking, governments in India, whether belonging to the BJP or to the Congress, have actually worked on that basis, and I would hope that we can keep this going. This is the reason why I said that I would not want to see the NSG membership being made into a very major point of friction between
now,
the two countries.
If we look at Seoul, whether we say that China hid behind these other 6 or 7 countries, or the other way around, the 6 or 7 countries hid behind China, it's clear that the opposition, whether in procedural or process terms, was more than simply pitching, and that 7 or 8 countries raised the need for objective, I think Brazil said, non-discriminatory criteria for membership of non-NPT countries. Now, the question that comes to my mind is that when the 2008 waiver uses pretty clear language about the need for broadening the effective implementation of the goals of the NPT. When you use that phrase, you're implying that India will never be a member, but there's no reason why India cannot help to contribute towards the goals of NPT, primarily as a nuclear weapon state, that you won't proliferate, and I suppose that you will also work towards universal disarmament. Now, India fulfills both of these conditions and more. If we won that battle in 2008 and actually then agreed to abide by 7 or 8 commitments, and the world can see that we have stuck by those commitments, why is it that we haven't managed to convince these 7 or 8 countries?
This is the irony, that we were engaged in far more complex, far more difficult negotiations on that waiver document. This would have been a very simple case of either yes or no on the membership.
Because the waiver is a much bigger obstacle than membership.
Exactly. So, it should have been a very simple matter to actually admit India into the NSG based on precisely those conditions that are listed in the waiver. That did not happen. That did not happen because of procedural reasons. We should recognize that there are important political reasons behind this. This is why I said that there is a change as far as the Chinese posture is concerned. China is no longer hiding behind, other countries. China, my sense is that China would have been ready to be the last man standing if it came to that.
Right.
Because...
So if things were pressed for an up-down vote, China would say, fine,
I mean,
my veto.
That's my judgment. I cannot prove it in any way, but my sense is the change that has taken place in China is precisely that. That today, I am ready to take a public posture on this. I am ready to be the last man standing if it comes to
So what explains that? Is it because of their perception that India has drawn close to
the
United States?
My sense is that, number one, China is in a sense demonstrating that as far as these global regimes are concerned, it will no longer just be a spectator. It is par in the same league as the United States of America, and it is ready to play that role. Second, and I think it is important for us to look at the implications of this. This represents a level of commitment to Pakistan which is more than what we have seen in the
past. So this is a new factor actually.
Yes. It is not only as a proxy against India, which has been the traditional role that Pakistan has played, but also to my mind the role that Pakistan is potentially going to play as far as the very ambitious, one belt, one road ambition is concerned. Pakistan is a very key factor in the success of that particular, Xi Jinping's great project.
With the China-Pakistan economic corridor.
Exactly. So I think there is a willingness to show that because our interests are involved here, we are ready to give satisfaction to Pakistan, because for Pakistan it is far more important not to have India in and Pakistan out than it is for frankly speaking for India, because India has the waiver, Pakistan does not. So in a sense, the commitment to Pakistan is greater, and that has implications for India, which we should be looking at. The third is, I think the Chinese sense that this hyphenation between China and India, which is being sort of fostered by the United States and others, this simply does not exist. This is one way of demonstrating
that these are two rising powers in Asia and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So that equivalence that people have tried to bring about to show that this is simply not true. We are in the driving seat. So there is a more assertive China. There is a China which believes that it is already in a very different league than, say, India is, or several other middle powers are concerned, and therefore the world must
and the China-Pakistan relationship has strengthened.
Right.
What about the Chinese reading of the India-US relationship? Is that also somewhere a factor that they see India now? For example, the quadrilateral has been revived: India, Japan, Australia, and the US and Asia. We have repeatedly made statements about freedom of navigation in South China Sea. Are these also elements which may have
it may be
element the Chinese leadership?
There may be an element of concern, but I think China is fully aware of the fact that India is not going to become a subordinate ally of the United States, as, say, for example, Japan is, or say Australia is. That there is a degree of convergence between India and the US as far as the security environment in the region is concerned, that is quite apparent. However, I think we also need to be able to project that much of that convergence is as a result of the actions of the Chinese themselves.
Right.
Recently I was in Beijing, and we were having one of these track 2 dialogues, and if China says we are not against the freedom of navigation, and yet in the next breath says that as far as the 9 dotted line is concerned, these are the historic waters of China,
yeah.
Then how are you going to have freedom of navigation if you are virtually saying that this is part of a part of Chinese jurisdiction?
Right.
So there are actions on the part of China which do cause a concern. We ourselves
they've sharpened their border confrontation with virtually all their neighbors.
Yes, I mean there has been. Everybody recognizes, even the Chinese themselves recognize that they have been far more assertive. Now they should not be surprised if the rest of the world is reacting to that. And the other aspect is that with we see, for example, in Asia Pacific, ASEAN was not a major power, but as a platform, regional platform, it was useful to all the major powers.
Yeah.
As a kind of a mediating platform, as a kind of a reconciling, and providing a little bit of a buffer in what could be major power, conflict. In the last few years, China has actually abandoned that kind of a, I would not say a explicit consensus, but a implicit consensus that we should not undermine ASEAN because it is useful to us. Now you see China going all out in terms of dividing ASEAN,
exactly.
you know, and that is not good for the region, and I believe it's not good for China either. So when we use this mantra that we have been using, I think one should not dismiss it only as a mantra, that we need to have an open, inclusive, you know, transparent and balanced security architecture in the region, which does not exclude China. But China should see its interest in that kind of a multilateral framework rather than seek unilateral dominance. That is something which will inevitably invite a countervailing response.
So there's a question or a comment from Samar Jodha who says, this is the larger issue here. China at every point wants us within South Asia, Pak engagement being one. Do we have any long-term strategy, or will we each time be reduced to shadow boxing? And is there a danger in America, in India, becoming an outsourced wing of the United States?
Well, I do not think that India is in danger of becoming an outsourced wing of any power, because India itself is a major power. But with regard to what is our strategy against you know, China trying to sort of keep us tethered in South Asia, the obvious strategy is that you need to have a much better environment in the subcontinent itself.
With your neighbors.
Yeah. You know, so unless you follow a very, very active, properly nuanced policy with respect to your South Asian neighbors, including Pakistan, and you become a champion of, say, regional integration in the region, you become the engine of growth for your neighbors, who begin to see you as an opportunity rather than as a threat.
Right.
If you create spaces, somebody will walk in. So our effort should be to make certain that as far as the subcontinent is concerned, we don't create those spaces. That we become the most relevant power for our neighbors, not because we are able to impose upon them, but because we offer better opportunities than any other power can. I think that should be really our response.
Manisha Chachara asks, with India making efforts to be a part of NSG, is the idea of NAM, or non-aligned movement, as a foreign policy objective or principle still relevant? You and I were part of non-alignment, non-alignment 2.0, so I know how you'll answer this.
Yeah, so maybe I don't need to answer it, maybe you can answer it.
For the benefit of our viewers and readers.
Yeah. There is no doubt that the non-aligned movement, you know, has become a pale shadow of what it was. And that is because there is a completely changed geopolitical situation. I mean, you don't have a Cold War, you don't have a East-West confrontation, even the North-South confrontation has become somewhat different than before. So the non-aligned movement itself and its role has become diminished. There is no doubt about that. However, as we have argued in the non-aligned 2.0, that non-alignment as a policy or non-alignment as a framework within which India orders its relations with the rest of the world, I think it still remains relevant, because my view has been that non-alignment is nothing more than another name for strategic autonomy. And what is strategic autonomy? Strategic autonomy is that on matters of vital interest to India, it should be able to take relatively autonomous decisions. You know, it cannot take completely autonomous decisions, because you live in a world where you have to interact with so many other powers.
Yeah.
You know, not all interests are vital, and therefore you should distinguish what is really important for you and what is not important for you. So as we discussed with regard to the NSG membership, I do not see that as an elemental issue, you know, that requires a very, very major diplomatic effort on our part going forward. But on whether or not you have the capability and the willingness and the intention to take those relatively autonomous decisions on issues which we have determined are of vital interest to India, that is what non-alignment to me is the philosophy of non-alignment.
We're almost out of time, but I just want to come back to Seoul and the NSG. On the second and final day of the plenary, the meeting concluded with Mexico making a proposal for the NSG to continue to remain engaged on this issue of membership criteria for non-NPT countries, particularly India, and that seems to have carried the day. There will probably be another meeting later this year. Assuming that this happens, say in November or December, India has a good 5 or 6 months. What do you think is the conversation that we need to have with China, as well as with 5 or 6 of the other holdouts, but primarily with China? What can we say or do to make sure that this goes
the first order of business is that whatever criteria are going to be discussed, they do not go beyond what is there in the waiver.
Exactly.
That's very important. Right. So, if we perceive that the discussion may veer in a direction where instead of opening the door to membership, it actually becomes a occasion for imposing more onerous conditions for membership, I think we would be well advised to.
Such as signing CTBT or agreeing to a moratorium on fissile protection.
I mean, because we are not
the
there.
Things that they pushed in
because we are not there.
Exactly.
And, you know, the evangelical countries will want to bring in as many as we saw in 2008.
Right.
So I think we have to be a little circumspect and a little, shall I say, alert to the possibility that in seeking membership, we do not actually open the door for more restrictive or onerous conditions being brought in. Yeah.
And in terms of the conversation with China, what can we say to push the envelope there?
Well, I think the diplomacy with China would really have to convince China that in terms of that larger, fabric of India-China relations and the many things on which we are working together and we need to work together. For China to, on procedural grounds, if China does not have really, as it says, any problem with India becoming a member, but it is only a procedural issue or a technical issue, then I think our effort should be to convince China that insisting on those technical grounds, having conceded the waiver for which we appreciate China's stand, does not really make sense, because there is a much larger.
But given that the Chinese objection is primarily political rather than
well, it is political, although it is being projected as procedural. So you operate on that basis.
Right.
If the Chinese are saying it is procedural, why do I want to go to them and say no, it is political?
No, not as a tutu member, but insofar as we understand some of the underlying.
So let us respond to what the formal Chinese position is, which is that it is procedural. So we can sit down and say, okay, if you have said this is procedural, can we?
Right. But a final thought. If, in fact, the strengthened Pakistan-China relationship is propelling China in taking a certain stand, is there something India could do with Pakistan? We've seen Prime Minister Modi, for example, say that he wants better relations with Pakistan. He's tried 2 or 3 times, but somehow that the car hasn't moved forward. But is there something we could do with Pakistan that would unlock this?
I think even though he may not have been successful, if you look at the record of not just Prime Minister Modi but our previous Prime Ministers as well, all of them recognized that it is very important to try and improve India-Pakistan relations, not to a level of bonhomie or friendship, but at least to the extent that it is a more normal kind of a state-to-state relations. I think that is a realistic objective.
Right.
And I think even if there are setbacks, even if there are issues, we need to be able to, pursue that policy with respect to Pakistan. My own sense has been that it is perhaps far more realistic to gain by incremental steps with Pakistan. Whether it is with respect to trade or peoples-to-people relationships, or working on things which are of a larger interest like ecology or climate change. These are ways in which you can expand the scope of our engagement, even while we are dealing with difficult issues. But it is when you have a high-profile kind of a thing, like the Lahore visit, that sometimes there is almost inevitably a reaction from those who see in any improvement in India-Pakistan relations as a great threat to themselves. Somehow or the other, we need to neutralize that. And neutralization can be done, to my mind, given the record of what we were able to achieve in the 2004-2007 period, by really taking incremental steps. And I think that is the way to go.
We've covered a lot of ground in our conversation. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Well, it's been a roller coaster ride for India the last 11 years. 2005 is when India and the US first
issued a joint statement envisaging the ending of nuclear sanctions on India. 3 years later, the India NSG waiver was agreed, and now we've seen in 2016 the Indian effort to join the NSG stumbling at the door because of opposition from China and a handful of other countries. We know that this issue will be raised again later this year. Be sure to tune in or regularly check in with thewire.in for our foreign policy coverage and our coverage of the nuclear issue to learn what happens to the story. Certainly, we haven't seen the last chapter written on this yet. Thank you for joining.